Aetherdrift is coming out on Arena tomorrow, so I wanted to go through, talk about some of the cards that I may have gotten wrong, and kind of reevaluate the set after the early access event uh, and watching a bunch of content from it. The set adds 291 cards to standard, and I previously made a video that kind of went through the top 40 cards. So I recommend checking out that video because I will try and reference some of my expectations from that video. And I'm going to be talking about cards that either overperformed or I didn't mention, underperformed, or I didn't mention in that video, and try and talk about the set overall. So anyways, hopping into it, I think overall the set is actually going to be more impactful to standard than I originally thought. I think that there's some interesting niches and some just kind of good role player cards. Anyways, hopping into the first card here that I kind of just missed was Gastral Thrill Seeker. It's a 2 mana, 2/3. When it enters, it deals 1 damage to target opponent, you gain 1 life. And if you have max speed, you get Death Touch and Haste, and it starts your engine. Why is this card important? Well, I just didn't realize that there was a card that you could play and it instantly gets you from 0 speed to 2 speed. Because it enters, you get your engine, so you're at 1, and then it deals the 1 damage and gets you to 2. I think this is going to be a pretty good role player for any decks that care about speed in particular, and then also as relevant creature type as Lizard, since Bloom Burrow gave us a lot of Lizard cards, and then also like it has a pretty good payoff for max speed. So maybe if speed's super relevant, this card will see some more play. One card that I didn't talk about is Voyager Glidecar. I didn't talk about it because I didn't think it was going to be good, because it's really not Warden of the Inner Sky. It's restricted to only tapping down creatures, which makes it much worse. And I think early access event kind of proved this to me. I don't think this card is going to be super good, but maybe I'll eat my words on that. Medicant Core, this was another one I kind of didn't make the cut of the top 10 rares, but because I was like, okay, we have Regal Bunnycorn in standard. That's a 2 mana creature that also gets big, but it also has like increased toughness, whereas Medicant Core can die to nowhere to run. But I think Medicant Core is a good role player in those artifact decks, because every artifact you add to the battlefield gets you towards your affinity count, which can be very relevant. And then if you do actually get that max speed ability and get to copy up an artifact, that can be very impactful. So I think this card overall exceeded expectations. It's a 2 mana thing that's really big, can trade up, and then can get extra value if it gets to stick around with max speed. So just better than I thought. Perilous Snare, another one that I was like, okay, this is Oblivion Ring. But it's a really good role player in the artifact decks, which that was one of the popular things, because we also have Memory Guardian. Memory Guardian, I thought this card was going to be harder to cast since there aren't artifact lands, but if you get enough of those like dinky 1 mana, 2 mana artifacts, it can help out. And even if this only costs 2 mana, it accelerates your Simulacrum Synthesizer. You really want to be able to trigger Synthesizer like multiple times really quickly, so you can kind of wall up against your opponent, since it's a 3 mana artifact that doesn't do much. So if you can play this and then play the Memory Guardian here, it actually gets much better. So I think overall these artifact decks was one of the popular archetypes from early access that kind of stood out. Now, okay, this was a pretty gross card to see in action. CGB was playing this card. It's Ancient Vendetta. It's basically like a surgical extraction type card where you can rip one card in particular from your opponent's deck, their hand, their graveyard, and their library. It's a little different than some of the other ones because you don't get, like, if it's in their hand, they don't get to draw a card. It's comparable to, like, I compared it to Stonebrain in my mind. And so I was like, okay, this card's not going to see that much play because Stonebrain doesn't really see that much play. It's 4 mana to try and like screw up your opponent's plan. But what I didn't consider is that Stone Brain, it's kind of clunky to use because you play it and then you have to pay to tap it and do it all. Basically what I'm trying to get to is I saw CGB use Beseech the Mirror to then go grab the Ancient Vendetta and instantly cast it. So they can play like one copy of Ancient Vendetta and then tutor it up with the Beseech the Mirror. And if your opponent's playing a very specific combo deck, or like they have an important piece of their deck that their deck functions around, it can be absolutely brutal. So I can imagine this being more relevant in Standard than I initially thought, and actually way more relevant than Stone Brain, just because you can work it into a kind of Beseech the Mirror toolbox, which is pretty cool. And speaking of gross things that you can do with the color black, you have Momentum Breaker. Now, I talked about this card in my previous video, but the reason I have it on this list of like cards that I got wrong, it's not because I really got it wrong, but it's just, it exceeded expectations. This card is disgusting. It's going to see play in the Dimir Imbalance. It's better than I expected, and it's kind of saddening because it means the reality is Dimir is going to be probably still the best, or well, it's definitely, it's not probably, it is going to be the best deck in Standard, following Aetherdrift. I don't think any of the new decks necessarily will I think they'll be interesting, but I think Dimir will stay top dog. It was basically what I gathered from that. Now, again, another black card here. We have Quag Feast. I didn't talk about this one, but I was like, okay, it's a sorcery speed removal for creatures, planeswalkers, and vehicles, but the reason why this card is so relevant was there's a lot of graveyard synergy decks going around. You had like Loot Cauldron decks, you had Insidious Roots decks, and as well as there was like the Colstoke Gear Hulk kind of clone combo deck, and all of those had the opportunity to play Quag Feast as a way to fill their graveyard while also casting removal. So this card, while it's not necessarily an insane card, seems like it has a better role to play than I may have initially given it credit. And I talked about goblins. This card didn't make it into the top 10, but goblins, they seem pretty good. And so I just wanted to mention Burnout Bastronaut, new card for goblins. It's definitely going to see play in those goblin decks. Are goblins going to be tier 1? Probably not, but who knows. Cards, another card that just barely didn't make the list, Dredger's Insight. As I was saying, a lot of graveyard, so you had artifact decks, you had graveyard decks, kind of. Well, you had the Simulacrum Synthesizer, or like affinity decks, and then you also had like Agatha's Soul Cauldrons with loot, and you had Insidious Roots, and then you had like these self-discard decks, the cycling decks. Those are probably like the 4 big archetypes from the early access event. And Dredger's Insight, I thought this is just a worse version of Peerless Recycling, or Cash Grab. That's what it is. I thought this was just going to be like a worse version of Cash Grab because you're limited to artifact creatures and lands, but the life gain proved to be more relevant than I thought. It's just a nice card. That's all I can say. And speaking of, you know, exhaust, Agatha Soul Cauldron graveyard decks, one of the combos that I thought was really interesting was between these two cards. So you had Draconautics Engineer and Afterburner Expert. Afterburner Expert, if it's in your graveyard, when you activate an exhaust ability, you get to return it to the battlefield. And this works really, really well with Draconautics Engineer, where you can pay 1 to exhaust it, and creatures you control gain haste until end of turn. So this is kind of like a Vengevines at home, sort of. But yeah, this was seeing play in those kind of teamer loot, like self-mill, exhaust, Agatha Soul Cauldron decks. And in terms of graveyard decks, Moltender kind of exceeded expectations in like the Insidious Roots decks. It works really well with Tyvar because you can go ahead and tap to mill, and then go ahead, exile one of your creatures to get your Insidious Roots trigger. So yeah, just pretty good in that regard. A rare that I didn't talk about is a Regal Imperiosaur, and it seemed to be relatively good just because you have the like 2 1-drop mana dorks with Llanowar Elves, Ixali Lorekeeper, and then you have Pugnacious Hammerskull as a 3-drop big dino, and then you get the new Regal Imperiosaur as another big 3-drop. So you can play one of the 1 mana dorks on turn 1, turn 2 you drop these big dinos and try and smash face. I don't know how great this will be, but it seemed to have some interesting legs in the event. But yeah, I just didn't mention it, and I thought it was relevant because maybe smashing like a Stompy deck will be somewhat viable. And Thunderous Velocipede I didn't mention in the video, but it's a pretty good green vehicle for green. Has a nice interaction with Balustrade Worm, which is a 5-drop, and so with the vehicle gets 3 counters and is basically a 5 mana trampling haste 8/8, which is cool. I saw that, and I believe it was Mythic Mike's video. Now, I was talking about the like kind of 4 major archetypes that we're seeing play in this early access event. In the early access event, there was a lot of Pro Tour people or players that were invited to it, I think, and I saw a fair amount of them playing. Among them, there was a fair amount of Insidious Roots, as well as the self-discard decks using Marauding Mako. I don't know how much of the pro players were playing the Simulacrum Synthesizer decks or the Loot Cauldron decks, but anyways, one of the decks that I definitely saw was these kind of cycling decks using Marauding Mako, Scrounging Skyray, and to a lesser extent, Monument to Endurance. The impression that I got from all of this, though, was I put Monument to Endurance as like my #1 rare. It was more so, because I was like most excited about it as an interesting build around. I think in the self-discard decks, there's kind of a dichotomy between Monument to Endurance and these Makos and these creatures that grow bigger. The Monument to Endurance didn't seem the best for these creature decks. I think they want to be more creature focused and lower to the ground using like Inti and those sorts of effects to discard. But I think Monument to Endurance still seem to be pretty interesting in those decks. I definitely will be building around it as soon as it comes out, though. So still excited for it. But I'm not entirely sure if it fits in those more aggro leaning self-discard decks. Haunt the Network, I didn't talk about this as an uncommon, but it is definitely got some legs as an uncommon because it's 5 mana to make 2 Thopters, and then you drain your opponent equal to the number of artifacts you control. So if you copy this up with a Cursed Mirror or Curse Recording, you can go ahead and drain your opponent for quite a bit. And if you're playing some artifacts, besides that, you can see how this could be quite the brutal engine. The Aetherspark. Okay, now this was a card that I was cautious about in the previous video, but I have to say this card is not going to make an impact on Standard. I don't think. It looked clunky as all get out. The Aetherspark, why is this card not great? Is it felt like a lot of the times it came down, the game was kind of already decided, and either this card didn't really help you win, or it didn't save you if you're behind. So like it doesn't seem like it's gonna make an impact on standard. It's really easy to remove if opponents are loaded with artifact removal, or if they have ways to remove planeswalkers, or if you attach this to a creature and they remove that creature in response. It's an ugly sort of problems. So definitely gotta be my biggest disappointment in terms of cards. I was hoping it would be kind of interesting, but unfortunately not. Okay, now I want to talk about the Gear Hulks. The first, or like the major one that I kind of want to adjust my perception on, or my rating on, is Bright Glass Gear Hulk. I put it towards the bottom of like the Gear Hulk rankings, but I think it's better. It's got to be like firmly in the top 3 of the Gear Hulks. I think I put it last. Well, not last, but 4th in the Gear Hulk rankings. And I think Bright Glass Gear Hulk is probably better than the Coalstoke Gear Hulk. Because I feel like Coalstoke Gear Hulk, it's kind of expensive. It's got to find a new deck, or like it's got to build a new deck around it, which is the difficult part for Coalstoke Gear Hulk. There's people trying to do like the reanimated clone and kind of chain that together by cloning the Gear Hulk. So I don't know if anyone really gave Coalstoke Gear Hulk a full fair chance in terms of just playing it in a Rakdos mid-range deck. But yeah, I was less impressed with the Coalstoke Gear Hulk and more impressed with some of the Bright Glass Gear Hulk decks that were using it to kind of draw 2 cards when it enters and find some like Swiss Army knives or like removal pieces and stuff using the tutor effect. So Riptide Gear Hulk, I think this card stays firmly at the top of the Gear Hulk rankings. I had it as first, and it seems like the 5 toughness is absolutely insane to try and deal with. So I think it will live up to like my first place ranking in terms of Gear Hulks. And Oil Deep Gear Hulk, I think it's still a solid second in terms of the Gear Hulk ranking. So as I was saying, it's Riptide Gear Hulk number 1, Oil Deep Gear Hulk number 2, then it's going to be Bright Glass Gear Hulk, and then Coalstoke Gear Hulk, and then of course the most irrelevant of all the Gear Hulks, the Pyrowood Gear Hulk. So that is my adjusted Gear Hulk ranking. I'm excited to actually try out the Gear Hulk. So okay, now again talking about some of the big mythics, Ketramos. This card lived up to expectations. I didn't see opponent. I think Indestructible. I underrated how hard it is to deal with in the wrong color pair. So if you're playing like an Izzet self discard deck with the Marauding Makos and stuff, Ketramos seems really hard to deal with because of the Indestructible. So I think this card will have a significant impact on the meta, and I saw it draw tons and tons and tons of cards in some matchups. So Ketramos, it lived up to expectations. Probably going to be one of the best mythics from the set. I put it at number 1. It is still firmly at number 1. It kind of exceeded my expectations to some degree, but I do think that being indestructible, Orzhov, like a strong engine and everything, if you run into mirror matchups or like the removal you want to play in a Ketramos deck dunks on other Ketramos decks because you're going to be exiling stuff. So there is that downside, but still really good card. Now Loot, the last of the bunch of cards that I want to talk about. This card, I'm still a little bit unsure about it in terms of like playing it out by itself, but it seemed to do pretty good in the Cauldron decks. I think I was pretty accurate in saying that this card is mostly a Cauldron card, but it is not a bad card in general. I just don't think it's cut out to being like hard casted in general. But yeah, anyways, the real rundown from the their early access event was there was kind of 4 major archetypes that saw play. There was the artifact decks with simulacrum synthesizer. There were the loot, like cauldron decks, or like teamer exhaust decks that were using the Draconautics engineer, the grease wrench, or what the heck was that thing? Sorry, I gotta go back to it. Where are you? Afterburner expert and Draconautics engineer. There was Insidious Roots was another popular one, and there's the cycling one. So to repeat one more time, it was like artifact decks with simulacrum synthesizer, teamer like graveyard exhaust decks with loot and cauldron, kind of is it self discard decks or self discard decks in general, and then Insidious Roots. I think that those were kind of like the 4 major ones. Obviously, I guess I kind of left Ketramos out of there, but there's I think overall the set is going to be a little bit more impactful than I expected. Some of these uncommons have a chance to make things interesting. So yeah, especially like Memory Garden. I thought that this card was still going to be kind of annoying to cast even with affinity, but who knows. Anyways, I will prevent myself from rambling and just end it here. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. I'm excited to play some Aetherdrift. And yeah, have a nice morning, evening, night, afternoon, wherever. And whenever you're watching, take care of yourself. Subscribe to see me play Aetherdrift, and ciao.